All right, welcome back. That was a quick turnover. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Fiona McQuarrie, who's going to give us a presentation on stranded credit. Have you ever wondered what happens to students and their academic credits if their student accounts get put on hold, most often due to unpaid debts at the institution? In effect, students on financial hold end up with what is being called stranded credit, where they are unable to obtain an official transcript until they are able to settle their debts. How prevalent is this situation, and what are some of the practices that are currently taking place with regards to stranded credit? Well, here to tell us more about it is Dr. Fiona McQuarrie, who's going to provide an overview of her research on this topic. And once again, she's standing by live to answer your questions at the end of this session.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on stranded credit. I'm Fiona McQuarrie. I'm the Special Projects Officer at BC-CAT. Stranded credit is a topic that's been the subject recently of some very interesting research in the United States. BC-CAT is currently conducting a research study to see whether stranded credit is an issue here in British Columbia, and if so, what might be done to reduce it. To start with, I'm going to explain what stranded credit is and talk about some of the research in the US that's explored this topic. Then I'll discuss some of the preliminary findings from BC-CAT's own research study that's looking at stranded credit in the British Columbia post-secondary system. And I'll follow up with some recommendations. The recommendations may be useful in identifying ways to address the conditions that may lead to stranded credit, as well as helping to address it when it happens. So to start out with, let's look at what a definition of stranded credit is. Stranded credit is credit that a student has acquired but can't use for program or credential completion because they can't document it. Students with stranded credit are generally students who have acquired credit but who owe unpaid debts to the institution where they acquired the credit. Those unpaid debts could be tuition fees, student loans, ancillary fees, residence fees, any kind of fee or expense that the institution has charged to the student and the student has not paid. If a student has unpaid debt, most institutions will generally put a hold on the student's account. This hold is usually called a transcript hold or a financial hold. What that means is that the student will not be issued an official transcript by the institution until the student pays the outstanding debt on their account. Official transcripts from post-secondary institutions can be required for many purposes, such as getting hired, getting promoted, being admitted to another post-secondary institution, or verifying the student's attendance at post-secondary. If a student can't get an official transcript, the credits that they've earned at that institution may be stranded because the student cannot use them. So what do we know about stranded credit? Well, as I mentioned, most of the research on stranded credit has mostly been conducted in the US. The US and Canadian post-secondary systems are, of course, not identical, but here are some of the most important findings from that research in the US. Stranded credit is a reminder that students and post-secondary institutions are generally considered to have a contractual relationship, and that the post-secondary institution is generally considered to own the credits and the transcripts, even though the student paid for the courses and took the courses that earned them the credits, and even though the transcript reflects the student's own academic record. As I mentioned earlier, stranded credit can be a major problem for students that have it. The US research also indicates that stranded credit tends to occur more often in specific demographic groups, such as students of color, female students, and students from disadvantaged communities. This is because these students may be more likely to encounter financial difficulties during their education, also may earn less after graduation, and that can make it hard for them to pay off any debts that they incur during their education. Students use different strategies to avoid the negative effects of stranded credit. Some students give up on post-secondary education entirely, which might also include abandoning their debt that they have racked up at their institution. Others change their program or change their institution and start all over again. Obviously, this incurs some time and resource expenditures for these students, but it seems that the students consider that to be less expensive than paying off the debt that they owe at the other institution. Also, some students try negotiating with the institution where they owe the debt and try to reach some sort of arrangement where they can get a transcript without paying off all of the debt. Now, most recently, some US states have actually banned post-secondary institutions from withholding transcripts from students, even if the students have unpaid debts. The rationale for these bans is that if students cannot get their transcript, they cannot get the better jobs or additional education that might help them to earn enough money to pay off their debt. So because BC-CAT's mandate includes transfer credit, the research study that I'll describe is focusing on the effect of stranded credit on transfer credit. Most institutions require an official transcript to be submitted with an application for admission or with a request for transfer credit. If a student can't get an official transcript, they likely won't be accepted at another post-secondary institution, and any credit that they've acquired elsewhere will likely not be eligible for transfer. And that means that the credit is essentially lost, which limits the student's opportunities. As I mentioned, this can have major negative impacts on the student's future earnings and educational options. So now I'm going to describe the research study on stranded credit that BC-CAT is currently conducting and bring you some of the preliminary findings from that study. So the study that BC-CAT is conducting has two parts. One is a review of the policies at the 39 institutions that belong to the BC transfer system to see what happens if students have unpaid debts at those institutions. The second part of the study is a survey that was sent to the registrars at those 39 institutions. The survey asked questions about things like when the institution will or will not issue an official transcript, when holds are placed on student accounts, and the documentation that the institutions require to give transfer credit. We realized when we were designing the survey that registrars may not have complete information about student accounts with holds on them, because at some institution that falls into the responsibility of the finance department. The registrar might be asked to put a hold on a student account, but might not know what type of unpaid fees or what amount of unpaid fees has led to the request. However, we felt that registrars could provide important information on stranded credit, even if they did not have full information on how the credit had become stranded. So as of this week, 28 of the 39 institutions have completed the survey, which is an excellent response rate. And of course, BC-CAT is very grateful for that participation in the survey. So here are some of the preliminary results from the data collection. At most institutions, in an average semester, less than 10% of student accounts have financial holds or transcript holds. These amounts are consistent with the amounts identified in the US research on stranded credit. In reviewing the policies at the member institutions, all of the institutions have some provision for putting a hold on a student's account or on a student's transcript. The conditions vary somewhat across institutions. At some institutions, a transcript hold is put into place as soon as the student has any unpaid debt. At other institutions, the hold is placed only after a certain amount of time has passed, or if there have been attempts to contact the student about the debt and not received any response. So the possibility of a transcript hold is pretty consistent across the BC post-secondary system, but there are some differences in the conditions. But at most institutions, a hold on a student account means that the student will not be able to receive an official transcript. Most institutions also place other restrictions on a student account, such as the student not being able to graduate. The survey asked if institutions would accept other documentation for transfer credit if the student was not able to provide an official transcript, and nearly all of the institutions said no. However, most institutions were also very proactive in helping students avoid or manage financial problems that might lead to stranded credit. Some of the things that institutions do include monitoring students' accounts to identify students who might be getting into financial difficulties, offering payment plans or other forms of gradual payment to students who owe money to the institution rather than expecting them to pay the entire amount at once, and referring students to resources or services that could help them address any financial issues. However, all of the respondents also felt that it was important for institutions to be able to use financial or transcript holds to motivate students to pay their debts. The reason that was given for this response is that institutions generally have fairly limited options if a student owes them money. But it was reassuring to see that most respondents did not see stranded credit as an issue at their institutions. So now I'm going to present some preliminary recommendations based on that data that have been collected for the study. Although stranded credit doesn't seem to be a significant system-wide issue in BC, it's still important for institutions and students to try to avoid it because of the negative impact that can have on an individual student. So these recommendations are based on the literature and on the preliminary survey results. Case-by-case flexibility is really important because every student has different circumstances. The research literature indicates that even students with good financial histories can suddenly have financial trouble because of an unexpected event like their car breaking down or a sudden illness. Most of the institutions that responded to the BCCAT survey have policies or practices that allow registrars or finance officers or both to deal with unpaid student debt in a way that addresses the student's specific situation. Several respondents to the survey said that their institutions try to be supportive rather than punitive, which is an excellent approach. There may be alternatives to institutions completely withholding transcripts while still motivating students to pay off their debts. For example, some US institutions will issue official transcripts for any semesters or periods of study when the student didn't owe money to institution and withhold the part of the transcript for the times when the student was in debt. Practices like this may be more supportive for students who are trying to improve their financial situation to pay off their debts. And along the same lines as being supportive rather than punitive, identifying and helping students at risk of financial difficulty helps both the student and the institution. Some of the strategies that were mentioned in the literature and also in the survey include, for example, monitoring students' accounts to look for patterns of consistent late payment of fees or other expenses. Those are the types of students that could be referred to financial counseling or financial assistance. And some BC institutions do that as well. Other institutions require students to access these kinds of services as part of any agreement between the student and the institution for debt reduction or a payment plan. And several respondents to the survey also noted that during the pandemic, they instituted installment payment plans for student fees rather than requiring students to pay one lump sum at the start of the semester. And although this wasn't specifically done to address stranded credit or financial issues, they found that it causes a big improvement in the rate of student payments. So they plan to continue that post-pandemic. So that's an overview of stranded credit and an overview of the BCCAT research that's currently going on in this topic. The BCCAT report will likely be released in the next couple of months. And if you'd like to learn more about stranded credit and its role in the BC transfer system, please watch for the announcement of that publication. It will be on the BCCAT website and also be distributed through BCCAT's usual communications channel. So thank you very much for attending the session. I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have.
All right, and now we're back live, and Dr. Fiona McQuarrie has joined me to answer your questions. Just as a reminder to everyone who's on the stream, please put your questions into the question and answer or into the chat so that we can relay them to Fiona. Fiona, maybe just to get things started, students with stranded credit come from across all backgrounds and programs. I'm wondering if you have any information on the demographics of the students who have holds on their accounts.
This was a question that was asked in the survey, and I think the first thing I would say about that is that about half the respondents who are registrars at the participating institutions said that they didn't see any trends across their institutions. But at the institutions that did, the students that had holds on their accounts tended to have between 0 and 45 credits and tended to be enrolled in first and second year courses. So it seems that if students get into the kind of financial trouble that leads to a hold on their account and possibly to stranded credit, it tends to happen early on in their programs. And this is consistent with the findings in the American literature as well, that students in two-year programs and less experienced students, for lack of a better term, tend to be the ones that experience stranded credit.
Was stranded credit more prevalent among certain tuition types, such as domestic versus international students?
Again, most of the respondents said there wasn't, but some of the respondents pointed out that they, at their institutions, they experienced fewer problems with account holds and stranded credit with international students because of the expectation of how international students have to pay, which is partly related to their being granted a visa to come to study in Canada. There was also a comment that in some kinds of programs, the students tend to be there on a sponsorship from an employer or from a professional association. And so those students tend to not have as many account holds because an external funder is paying for their tuition. So they're perhaps not experiencing the same kind of financial pressures that other students might be in terms of getting their tuition paid on time.
It's an interesting topic, and there's some chat in the chat link here with regards to what is the threshold that results in a student ending up getting a hold put on their account. In theory, a student could get put on financial hold if they accumulate too many parking tickets or library fines. But does any of your research support that, or is it really just a much more substantial amount before a student actually gets a hold put on their account?
It really depends on the institution. At some institutions in BC, account is maybe not put on hold right away, but is certainly noticed in terms of being eligible for a hold as soon as there's any unpaid debt. Some institutions have a threshold of between $50 and $200. So essentially a student can run an unpaid balance below that amount and not have a freeze. And most institutions do have provision for either the registrar or the chief financial officer to assess the situation on a case-by-case basis and make exceptions. But I also want to point out that most institutions, the respondents on the survey were very clear that they use unpaid fines. It's one of the few forms of leverage that they have to get students to pay fines. And this can apply to any kind of fine. It sometimes depends on what kind of fine the student has incurred or how many different kinds of fines the student has incurred, but they will use a transcript hold if they feel that's an effective way of motivating the student to pay whatever kind of unpaid debt they have.
And do you know that with regards to the transcript hold, I mean, that was pretty interesting. So is a transcript hold, is that the entirety of the transcript, or do they can they obtain a transcript for a record for the amount of credits that they've actually fully paid for?
At most institutions, it's a hold on the complete transcript, but in the US research literature, there is mention of some institutions that will release transcripts for the semesters when the students weren't in debt. So it's more like a partial hold just for the semesters where there was debt owed. But from the survey results, it seemed that most institutions in BC don't do that partial hold unless it's a case-by-case arrangement, that their policy is that the hold is on the complete transcript. And also for receiving institutions, that pretty much every receiving institution requires an official transcript. A student can't use an unofficial transcript to get transfer credit. And that's an issue if the student can't get an official transcript. It makes it very difficult for them to obtain transfer credit. The rare occasion, again, probably on a case-by-case basis where there were exceptions, is if, for example, the sending institution no longer exists. If the student has a transcript from when the institution did exist and it was an official transcript then, it seems from the survey results, I would guess that most institutions would consider that, even though it's not technically an official certified signed by the registrar transcript.
We have a question from the audience from Stephanie Boychuk from VIU, who asks, did the research separate by the kinds of funding? So for example, she has seen students who are band funded get flagged, which is extremely stressful for them. You mentioned a little bit about employer funding a little bit earlier. Did the research go into any other types of funding?
No, there wasn't a specific question about funding in the survey questions themselves. All of the comments about different kinds of funding came from the qualitative responses from the researchers. But Stephanie is quite right. This was a problem that was also raised in an earlier piece of BCCAT research about former students with lived experience in care, that if there is a discrepancy between the date when the funding agency produces the funds and when the student is expected to pay, that can put the student into financial arrears through no fault of the student's own. It's just that the two agencies are not aligned in terms of when the payment is expected and when it's provided. And yes, it can be very stressful for the student, definitely.
We have another comment in the chat from Andrew Wilson from ONCAT, who is literally sitting in our boardroom right now sending us chat messages. And he offers an example of where a student might be withdrawing from an institution or in the process of transferring and forget to drop courses, which results in their account being put on hold. Does that kind of raise the question about, is there an appeal process? What kind of opportunities are there for students to get the hold lifted from their accounts so that if there was an error made on their part or unintentional or not?
I would say from the responses in the survey that there's a very clear message from pretty much all of the respondents that students can ask for a case-by-case review of their situation. And if something like that happened where a student forgot to withdraw, was charged the tuition and then left the institution and didn't realize that they had been billed for the tuition for those courses, from my perspective in looking at the research and at this data, it seems to be that most institutions would be willing to at least consider that situation in a case-by-case basis.
All right. And I wondered, did your research uncover anything regarding the use of collection agencies so that it takes the debt sort of out of the hands of the institution and into the body of a third-party agency?
Yeah, about half of the respondents to the survey indicated that they routinely or in where it's warranted send their accounts to collection agencies. And that, on one hand, you know, the collection agencies are pros at doing this sort of thing, so they may be more skilled in being able to obtain payment. But the difficulty with using collection agencies is that they also charge fees and they also charge higher interest rates than the institutions usually do on unpaid bills. So if a student is already burdened with a financial account that they can't pay, and then additional charges get put on top of that because it's been sent to a collection agency and the collection agency is now charging as well, that can make it even more onerous for the student to pay off that bill. And one of the ironies or the paradoxes, I guess, that's mentioned in the American research literature is that oftentimes students need the official transcript because they need it for a job that's going to help them earn more money to pay off the debt. So withholding the transcript can be quite a significant barrier to them actually being able to pay off the debt that's holding back their credit in the form of the transcript.
We have a question about assessment. What is your opinion about evaluating and assessing an international 10 to 15 credit hour course against the benchmark of a 3 credit hour course in BC? So I'm not entirely sure how that relates to stranded credit, but perhaps it's, you know, if a course has a lot of credits in one institution versus a lower number of credits in another. I don't know if that has an impact on stranded credit. Did that anything like that come up in your research?
No, stranded credit is credit that the student has earned somewhere and can't transfer because they don't have an official transcript. The amount of credit, it's not a question of the credit not being able to transfer because it's not considered equivalent to a course at the receiving institution. It's credit that the student essentially can't transfer because they can't formally document it.
All right. Well, I think we are at time. I do have one final $1 million question. When is the research report going to be complete? And when can we expect it?
Hopefully sometime in the new year.
Sometime in the new year.
It's
All
getting
right.
close.
Sufficiently vague, but appreciate the the response. Okay, I think we're going to call this session to a wrap. Thank you, everyone, for asking your questions. We're going to take a break till about 2:15, and then we are going to start again with a session with. We'll be joined by Ben Farrell from the Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills Training, as well as Karen McCready, Executive Director of Education Planner BC, who are going to provide an overview of the Integrating Digital Services for Education and Career Planning initiative that is currently underway. So we hope to see you in about 15 minutes time.